And I was able to get my computer running again.
Okay, super.
And good morning, everyone. Our first keynote speaker of the day is Molly Kawahata. Molly is the founder of Systemic Impact Strategies, a climate consultancy, and the subject of Patagonia's new film, The Scale of Hope, a climate film sharing her life story, her work in climate communications, her passion for alpine climbing, and her journey with mental health. Molly's work today centers around how to harness psychology and neuroscience research to realign the climate movement around systemic change. She is a former climate advisor to the Obama White House, where she helped implement President Obama's climate action plan, as well as a former member of Google's energy team, where she helped launch the 24/7 Carbon-Free Energy Compact in partnership with the UN. Molly regularly does public speaking and podcasts to help an array of audiences, from companies to organizations to activists, focus their work around systemic climate action. She is a member in residence with Sea Change and an advisory council member to the AAPI Victory Fund. Outside of work, Molly is passionate about ice climbing and alpinism and loves climbing mountains in the Alaska Range. Welcome, Molly.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. Great to be here with you all.
Thank you so much for speaking with us today, Molly. And again, sorry for the technical issues. Thank you for joining us.
No problem. I know those are part of this. Thanks, everybody, for being patient as I got on.
Living in the time of Zoom webinars is still a learning experience 3 years later.
It really is.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Again, we know that you got up early. You rallied really early to speak with us. As someone who is not a morning person personally, I especially appreciate that. So thank you. So I also wanted to say that we do have plenty of time for questions at the end of the discussion. So please do feel free to hold on to those until the end of this session at 10. And feel free to utilize the Q&A function to ask some of those questions. I believe before our next session, we're just going to ask, since we've been having some issues with the chat feature, we're going to ask people to just leave and come back, and that should solve the issue, because we needed to change a setting on our end. But again, feel free to use the Q&A feature to ask Molly some questions here. And I'll go ahead and start us off with our first question of this discussion. So Molly, would you mind telling us a little bit about your, educational, professional, personal background? What got you to, where you are today?
Sure. I think I've had a bit of an unusual career path that certainly wasn't always super planned out. But starting with education, I went to UC Berkeley and had started previously with the Obama campaign. Obama was running for office when I was 17 years old. He had announced his run for office, and it was considered this totally improbable, impossible presidency. And everybody said that he had no shot of winning. So the only people that believed in him and really worked for him in the beginning were young people who didn't know better and who felt that a message was of hope, wasn't cynical, was something that they could actually believe in. And so I joined that campaign and then went to UC Berkeley, studied psychology, which I remember at the time thinking was not really relevant to what I was doing in politics, but was just interesting. And now I've seen how they've kind of all related in my life. And then after that, moved to DC, where I served as a political appointee in the Obama administration at the White House, first in the Office of Management and Budget, and then later on the climate policy team, which is probably what we're really going to talk about today. Budget stuff is not as exciting. And in really focusing on energy and climate kind of became the purpose and cause of my life. At the same time, it really wasn't this super focused career path. It's something I, in some ways, sort of fell into, but felt I really found my calling there. So after that, I knew that this was my path forward. I had a meeting with President Obama where he told me that I needed to make sure I continued in this and didn't kind of get distracted with other things I was interested in life, with like alpine climbing and other hobbies that you'd mentioned in the intro, and had moved to, I was at PG&E for a couple of years working on energy efficiency programs, because they are the largest utility in California and have an ability to, in a lot of ways, reach a lot of people on energy efficiency. And then later joined Google's energy team, where I was working on 24/7 CFE, which is what you also just mentioned. So that's kind of what got me to where I am today, which is now running running a consultancy called Systemic Impact Strategies. We work with nonprofits, corporations, small businesses, influencers, activists, people kind of from every walk of life that want to basically figure out how they can have a systemic impact on climate and lead in the climate movement. So that's kind of what I'm up to today. If that
Yeah,
gives that pathway.
Sure. So I guess my next question would be what, so you said that you kind of stumbled into this path, but were there, any events in your life that made you feel, when did you first learn about the impacts of climate change, and what made you, what started that spark, so to speak, I guess?
Well, there's something really interesting that's happened right now with the narrative. So I started to realize that I thought narrative change was probably the answer here, that we have the policy solutions and we have the technological solutions. What's really missing is making people feel like they have a chance of being a part of a movement that's going to truly solve this. And so there's been this perspective on the climate narrative that's based in kind of the adaptation and resilience perspective. Now, adaptation resilience is an extremely important and impactful part of policy on climate, which is really just saving lives in really important ways. This is really preparing for the impacts of climate change that are here and on the way. It's a lot of disaster response. It's a lot of building resiliency in communities. It's a lot of infrastructure, really, really, really important policies that save people's lives. At the same time, as a mainstream narrative, it is not super effective and it has limitations because it's sort of helped fuel this sort of doom and gloom mindset. I have a lot of friends who work in the resilience space and will say, let me do my job, don't use our narrative. And when I started looking about it from this perspective, the team I was on at the White House was focused on domestic climate mitigation. That means cutting greenhouse gas emissions at the source, at the sector within the US. That was kind of our mandate. So that looks like policies that are actually going to decrease greenhouse gas emissions, right? That's solving the climate crisis. That's solving the source of the problem. So when I looked at it from this perspective, like fuel efficiency standards for vehicles and carbon pollution standards for power plants, and a lot of these are fights we're still fighting, or things like tax credits for clean energy, which the Inflation Reduction Act really just started pushing at whole historic new levels. When I started looking at it from the mitigation perspective, it hit me that the climate crisis has an endpoint. If you look at it from the perspective of the source of the problem, there's a solution, and that's promised land is the zero carbon economy. And the best part about that is we are steadily marching toward it. So when I started realizing there was this feasibility component to climate, that we can do it and that we will get there and that we are on our way, we have this momentum, it really changed my perspective on the problem and how motivated people can be to be a part of the solution. So when we start giving out this mitigation narrative, it really can help change people's perspective and motivate them to act.
Absolutely. And as you know, today we're specifically talking about how these conversations about environmental sustainability and climate action are, two important components of this fight. And so when should we start talking to young people, especially those who are of school age, about climate change? And how do we start that conversation in a solutions-oriented way?
Yeah, it's so important. Well, I think immediately, as soon as people can learn about this, we should really make it part of people's everyday lives. And I don't mean that in a way that sounds dark. I really mean it in a way that one thing that's very important for children is for them to feel heard and seen and like they can be a part of something, that there's some sense of belonging. The climate movement can offer all of these things. Children, people of every age, children to adults, see and experience the impacts of climate change. They know what it's like to breathe dirty air. They know what it's like to be scared of a climate-related disaster that's happening, or to be aware of the fact that there are higher asthma rates in places, right? In some communities, children have asthma at inordinately high rates. Today, 1 in almost 5 Black children in America have asthma. So children experience the impacts of climate in very real and tangible ways. So we need to talk about that and make them aware of that and make them feel seen and heard given their experiences. At the same time, another really important part of this, when you look at this again from the mitigation perspective, is that there's this inclusive frame that's a part of it, which is that everybody is not only welcome in the climate movement, there has been a place waiting for them in this fight. And when you can look at it from that perspective, that everybody has a role to play and systemic change is the answer here, and you can step into your power, and the power you have is incredible. It's extraordinary. It can change policy. It can change elections. When you look at it from that perspective, you can really realize there's like this empowerment component that can really make people feel a sense of agency and autonomy. And I think that's a very important thing for children to experience in kind of every walk of life and in every domain. And that's how we can kind of do it from a climate perspective.
Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. And as a follow-up to that, what are some tangible ways that both young people and also educators, administrators, school personnel, education personnel can get involved in this movement?
Yeah, so for the first component, like a tangible perspective, I'm going to point you to, there's a lot of incredible research coming out of the University of Oklahoma on the science of hope. There's a really good TEDx talk on, if you search like the science of hope, Oklahoma, you will find this. There's a whole framework around this. There are ways we measure hope. And hope has powerful impacts on the human experience, right? If you experience childhood trauma and you have, when they're measuring hope, an increasing hope scale, you're increasing your levels of hope over time, then your probability of having a better outcome is much higher. People who have surgeries recover faster when they have an increasing score on the hope scale. So when you look at it from this perspective, there's this huge brain-body connection. Now, hope is a really important part of the climate movement. And a very important part of this is, again, like this agency component. Optimism is really this belief that the future can be better. And that's very important. But hope is your belief in your power to change it. And that's what's really key here when we're talking about climate, is that people have agency. And there's a lot of focus on kind of sustainable living, greening your life, which is really great and awesome. But the way we really solve the climate crisis is going to be through systemic change. Now, when you look at it from that perspective, that often looks like policy, government action, elections, and campaigns. Now, all of these things can be approached from a nonpartisan perspective. And I think in a lot of ways that's very important. But if you look at kind of how can I, as an individual, have power, including children who can't vote, which I was one of those kids that was working, helping on a campaign I couldn't vote in. The power people have in volunteering for campaigns and helping register people to vote in their communities and providing voting resources and helping get out the vote efforts, all of which can be nonpartisan, can be really impactful way to have an impact, because ultimately, when you register new voters, pro-climate candidates get elected. And when pro-climate candidates get elected, they're the ones who are going to institute policies that are eventually going to do things like shut down power plants, refineries, clean up highways in your community, which is ultimately going to clean up the air and improve public health outcomes, especially for marginalized communities and those who are most impacted, which are communities of color, at an even higher rate than poor communities. So it's really important we're looking at it from the systemic perspective. Hope has a huge impact on influencing systemic change, and systemic change is where every children's, administrators, community members' true power lies.
Absolutely. Thank you. And it's interesting. All of these these data about environmental hazards disproportionately affecting communities of color, low income communities. The data here in Pennsylvania, as we saw in our State of the Schools report, also echoes that. So that's absolutely especially applicable to this more Pennsylvania focused context as well. And so in such an emotionally charged space as the climate movement, how do you combat burnout and stay motivated to continue pursuing this change? And how would you recommend other people deal with that as well? I mean, now authorities are recommending everyone get screened for anxiety when they are children, for example. And I think that, again, this mental health context really matters. So how does your story inform that? How would you recommend people to overcome those feelings of burnout?
Absolutely. I love this question. I do want to back up really quickly and just address the first part of what you're saying, which is really kind of diving into public health, which is a lot of what we're talking about today, right? So communities of color are significantly likelier to have to live behind things like refineries, power plants, polluting highways, toxic waste sites. and more so than low-income communities. And this is a really important thing for folks to understand. There are policies in place that have actually made it so that communities of color are most targeted. And what this really means is that we've made policy decisions. These are not natural outcomes, policy decisions that have gone into whose health matters and whose health is considered expendable. Now, clean air, as we all know, is a human right. Clean water is a human right. There is nothing more fundamental to survival and living and to being human. So the idea that clean air in America has become a privilege is something that really, really, not only is there a moral component to this, of course, but there is a policy component that can only be addressed systemically. Now, so I just want to address that very quickly. That's kind of the whole cornerstone of environmental justice is public health. So your question about burnout, which is a really great question, I would really refer folks back to this HOPE scale, just because this is really getting at, again, when you are addressing childhood trauma, when you are addressing bodily trauma, when you're addressing medical procedures people have experienced, things that have happened to their actual physical self, increasing rates on the HOPE scale have a huge influence on improved outcomes in life later on, as well as immediate outcomes. So hope is very important here. And this is something President Obama started talking about. Now, we probably don't know if he had access to this research and was looking at it from that perspective. He had another perspective of his life experience that he was getting at hope, but it's incredible to see how it's backed by science. And so I would say that the best panacea to combating climate anxiety, climate guilt, climate depression is getting involved and giving people their power back. Because what pains me the most is when people say, I feel powerless. And first thing to do is empathize with that, right? I do completely understand why somebody would feel that way. And it is valid, right? Validating that experience and those feelings. The second thing we can do after validating that is provide options and invite people in. And when we invite people into the climate movement and they can know it's a climate movement that's truly inclusive in every way, and that everybody has a part to play, and that this is where you can step into your power and influence systemic change, right? It's way more powerful to realize you not only have decisions, you not only have influence on your own life and the way you live it, but you have influence on society, on policy, on impacts, on clean air, on clean water. That's, I think, really where people feel that their burnout kind of can fade away. And that's really been my experience. I know what it's like to kind of work yourself into the ground, but at the same time, when you realize that there's kind of no higher cause than serving future generations in a public service capacity or in an activist capacity or in an educational capacity, there's really no stopping what you can do.
Absolutely. And I think you already kind of touched on this a bit in the answer to that question already. So thank you. But what role do you think, again, schools and educational institutions, or even, community environmental health organizations such as what roles can we play in inspiring this next generation of climate leaders? And what advice would you provide to people working specifically in those spaces? Because as we know, as you said, empowering people with the information and the hope, it's twofold, is so important. So how do we do that?
Absolutely. So I kind of hate it when people answer questions like this in very abstract ways. So I'm going to give you very tangible explanation of reframing and how this works. So I believe a fundamental part of the climate problem is a communications problem, and it is a narrative problem. And there was this moment I had, I'll tell you a quick story. I was sitting at my desk in 2015, and it hit me super suddenly that we could try to do everything we could in the climate space, in the policy space, but we would always be limited if we didn't have overwhelming support from the American people and those who represented them. All of a sudden, my theory of change started to evolve. And I started to realize how everything is connected. That you can't solve the climate crisis without systemic change, right? That's why I was in that building at the White House. You can't solve the system. You can't get systemic change without policy. You can't get policy until you get electeds. You can't get electeds until you get the public on board. And here was the realization: you can't expect to have the public on board until they feel something. And that last part, that people need to feel something in order to act, that was key. So this connection between policy coming down through kind of transitive property to human feeling was something I had never been considering. So when I started looking into this research, I started seeing, one, the power of hope, which we just talked about, but two, the impacts of doom and gloom, guilt, and shame. Now, psychology research is very clear on what this does. It harms people and it harms children in very clear ways. And I don't blame people for when they feel these experiences, they shut down. Your body takes up less physical space. You have a physical retraction, and it has a paralyzing response. You freeze. It's a trauma response. Now, we've been making people feel fear, guilt, and shame about climate and then asking them, why aren't you acting? When any psychologist who works in this space could have told you, not only are you making it hard to act, you're taking away their ability to act. You're taking that from them. Hope does the opposite. Hope motivates people. Hope empowers people, because there's this component, right? It's not just optimism in believing things can be better. It's not hoping for the best. It is your ability to shape it. Autonomy and control here are so important. People have control. They have agency. They have power. So that's the kind of emotion component that's really important. When we talk about reframing, we need to reframe from doom and gloom, anxiety, guilt, fear, shame, all the way to hope and opportunity and empowerment and inclusivity. Thing one. Thing two, I'm going to talk about reframing and how that works. So when you have a thought in your brain, it actually is firing a web of neurons in your brain. And when you have that thought again, it fires that same web of neurons again, and that web grows stronger. So there's this term in neuroscience that some of you may teach that says neurons that fire together wire together. Now, why are we talking about this? This is really important because you basically cannot negate a frame without advancing it. So that's to say that we often take the bait for anti-climate narratives without realizing it. And in our effort to correct them, we're helping them. So an example of this I'll give you is like if somebody is yelling climate action hurts the economy. It is not effective for me to go stand next to that guy and yell, no, climate action does not hurt the economy, because I am still wiring in your brain an association between climate action and a hurt economy wired. Even as I try to negate it, I say, no, doesn't, isn't. It has a pretty negligible impact on the human brain. You're using the same language. Now, what's way more powerful is for me to reframe this and to say something like, climate action represents the greatest economic opportunity of the 21st century. Climate action opportunity are now being wired. I have a better example, actually, because I love that we're talking about health. During the Obamacare debate, Republicans attacked, universal health care, and they attacked what Obama was doing. And they said, Obamacare costs too much. They were wiring in people's brains an association between Obamacare and cost. What President Obama did, instead of say, no, it doesn't cost too much, which is still associating healthcare with cost, he said, healthcare is a human right. Now, why is this powerful? There is no association within the human rights frame of cost, because you don't put a price on a human right. That's the point, right? You're completely reframing it into a new place that has a whole different set of components associated with that term. So this is why it's really important that we reframe from kind of talking about polar bears and things really far away, glaciers, which are important when you look at it from a science perspective and teaching it from a science perspective. But as a hope perspective, as a motivational perspective, we need to reframe that in terms of public health. Because again, nothing is more personal to people than the health and well-being of them, their children, their community, their parents, their neighbors, their schools, right? This is really important. So reframing this in terms of public health is really important. So this is how we can use the power of psychology and neuroscience to improve the climate movement, to make it more inclusive and to bring more people in. So think about the emotions people are instilling in children and the public, which are oftentimes really harmful. And if something is harmful, reconsider doing it, right? If it's like, okay, this whole film is about how people are doing everything wrong on climate, what emotions is that going to instill in children? Fear, guilt, shame. They have no autonomy, a lack of control, right? Think about that. And then if there's a new way to frame this in terms of hope, empowerment, opportunity, That's what we're getting at. That's what we want to focus on. So just think in terms of like the educational materials you're using, the curriculum, the focus. What are children going to feel? Not think, what are they going to feel? And that is going to be the biggest predictor of their outcomes and of how much they're going to want to be involved in the climate movement.
Absolutely. So again, as we know, I think, we're living in an age of misinformation, and it's gotten increasingly easy to spread falsehoods, especially about things like the climate movement. And so again, what are some of, I'm trying to think of a way to ask this question, being cognizant of this, reframing technique that you're talking about. So what are some of these myths, and how can we combat them in a helpful, positive way, rather than saying, no, you're wrong, the science says this? How do we again reframe these narratives that are so, I think, divisive to many?
It is, I struggle with the exact same thing, because in some ways you do want to correct the record, especially in an educational context, right? It's very important. So there's kind of a different context here than I would typically give like activists, is that of course children need to understand the facts, they need to understand the science. The educational component is very important. In addition to that, though, we really need to focus on the narrative and the feelings component. And that's like the second part that people aren't getting kind of anywhere. No one, in corporations, in schools, in the public, and in environmental organizations, no one's kind of getting that second part of like, what is the emotion here? So I would say what to focus on is correct the record to the extent that you have to, but when you're thinking about the narrative, reframe. And one of those components of misinformation, I think we often believe that climate deniers are the problem. And that they're kind of doing everything they can to obstruct everything. It's actually not so much climate deniers. Very few of them exist. And what's really interesting is people don't often realize that the vast majority of America on both political parties supports climate action. Not politicians, but the public. And the Yale program in climate communication has really good data that shows this, that illustrates this. This is about double what most people perceive the public supports. Most people believe that very few people support climate action, but it's the vast majority. So when you look at it from this perspective, we can think about the fact that there's growing support, and that what we can do, rather than focus on the idea of climate deniers when there are very few, like almost none, they really exist in the Cato Institute and in Congress. Really, what this ultimately is a salience problem. It's the fact that on all of the issues, climate change is not ranked always as the highest. Although in the last election, we are seeing a turn in this thanks to youth activists, which is the best thing ever. Gen Z is awesome, huge fan. This whole thing around, putting climate change as a higher issue, right? We're going to put all of these other problems as higher, even though climate change impacts all of them, right? Healthcare, immigration, economic policies, inflation, all of them are related to climate. So when we look at this ranking, climate change is really related to all 10 before you get to that one. The salience is the problem. And I believe that comes from the fact that people don't have autonomy. They haven't been given autonomy. So what we really need to do is, again, reframe this in a way that people can understand and feel. And that often looks like talking about public health, which is why I love what we're doing today. But at the White House, we actually did message testing around this, because there are a bunch of different ways to talk about climate change. It impacts every aspect and domain of life. So we tested all of them because we wanted to know which is effective and which are not. There's the national security frame, right? This is kind of the adaptation resilience, climate-related disasters, FEMA response, flood standards. It's not super effective because it scares the heck out of people. And in addition to that, they also often feel like, well, the disaster isn't right in front of me, right? It's not happening somewhere else. It's happening at a place in time, a moment in time. That's not like every day. It's kind of like seen as an aberration. That is changing, of course, right? More and more people are seeing the impacts of climate change in very tangible ways, whether it's wildfire smoke or increased hurricanes, like all of these things. But that we found wasn't super effective because of this fear component, and fear paralyzes people. There is also the environmental frame, right? This is saying, polar bears in the Arctic, melting glaciers, endangered species. Again, from an educational perspective, very important. We definitely want the science to be out there, especially in schools. In addition to that, though, when you're talking to the general public, and we have the levels of income inequality that we do in America, talking about polar bears is not super realistic for people who are struggling to get by, which are a lot of people, which are most people who are making, a lot of people in America are making very real decisions between affording rent and buying groceries. These may be some of your students. Asking somebody like that to care about things happening thousands and thousands of miles away, as we all know, is not realistic. We tested the economic frame, and at a macro level, this was saying that for every decade you don't fight climate change, it's going to cost our economy this much more. At a macro level, it's pretty abstract, and it's hard for somebody to feel that. They're just like, it's a big numbers and a big economy. When you talk about their personal job, that's a little more effective. But by far, by miles, what was effective was what we're talking about today, which was public health, right? This is the environmental frame of talking about power plants and highways and toxic waste sites and refineries and how that impacts the communities around them. Because another word for climate change is just clean air.
Yes.
That's really important. Another word for climate change is, it's really pollution. And the panacea of climate change is clean air. Pollution impacts every aspect of life. And let me tell you, there is nobody out there who's going to fight you on protecting pollution, on saying they want to increase the childhood asthma rate in their community. They want to increase the hospitalization rate, heart disease, lung disease, miscarriage, all of the things communities are impacted by when they live with and by pollution. So that's why it's effective. And it's effective too, because it's solvable, right? People know the stories of communities that have been impacted by horrific rates of pollution and have been able to solve it through policy. Again, not individually, not in their own lives, through policy, through the people rising up and making really big change happen at a systemic level. So public health is the way to talk about climate change, and that is the best thing we can do to help strengthen and improve and kind of realign the narrative.
Great, thank you so much. And I think my last question before we move on to getting some Q&A from the audience. What are some, examples of thought leaders, nonprofits, organizations that are reframing this narrative in a really effective way? Do you have, recommendations for? You've already provided a great TED Talk recommendation, but do you have books, research articles, things like that you would recommend people reading? And if you think of them and you'd like to, provide some links to us, we'd be happy to share that with all of the attendees today in a later email. So if you could speak on that a little bit, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Love this question because I love, the chance for folks to continue to get involved in this. The first thing I would point folks to is a book called The Political Mind by George Lakoff, or more generally, any work by George Lakoff. He's written like 50 books and he has a bunch of articles online. George Lakoff is the grandfather of framing in American politics. So he's a cognitive linguist who was at UC Berkeley for years. If you've heard of Frank Luntz, he kind of does it on the opposite side for progressive causes and using science, not marketing. So he's a cognitive linguist. He was at UC Berkeley for decades. And he's one of the foremost experts on metaphor and understands the power of language, that it's not just how we talk about something. It's not just marketing. It's not just selling something. It's not just communications, right? It is the basis of policy. It is the basis of systemic change. It is the basis of human emotion, is language and how we talk about it. So he's a really good person to check out to understand framing better. Another really good component here, I'm going to actually point people to a book that's not immediately related to climate, but kind of is if you think about it. It's called Lost Connections by Johan Hari, who is a journalist who went on a journey, because we kind of touched on mental health, and mental health is, of course, such an important part of children's lives, and something I think there's this incredible new movement to address it at a younger age, which certainly would help me when I was younger and living, I live with bipolar 2 disorder today. So when I was younger, that would have been incredibly helpful. But with that said, he wrote this book on depression, and he went on this journey to understand what is the latest research on depression, because he'd experienced it his whole life. And he found something really interesting. And basically, the answer was that connections have been lost. Community was the answer. And there are a lot of other components: disconnection from the natural world, children need nature. There's a lot of really interesting stuff in here. There's also some interesting stuff that dives into how universal basic income impacts mental health in really profoundly positive ways. There's not been a ton of research, but there's been a bit. And that's why I believe universal basic income could be a very important tool here for the climate transition. But this idea of mental health impacting your sense of belonging, your sense of community, that is really important in us understanding how the climate movement can be more inclusive and welcoming to everybody from every walk of life. I had another one, which I was organization, the Environmental Voter Project. They are a nonprofit, nonpartisan C4 that basically works to empower environmentalists to vote. They use incredibly cutting edge analytics. It's like a mix of incredible survey data plus consumer data plus algorithms that they use in order to target and find environmentalists who don't vote. Now, that's an incredible concept. And I didn't believe this existed. I was skeptical because I wasn't looking at the science of what they were doing. I was just like, I just don't believe it. Right. It's funny. Their data is incredible. And they have targeted by name and address these voters. So when it comes to an election, they use behavioral science strategies in order to turn them out to vote and make them into consistent lifelong voters, which means they're even working on local elections that a lot of folks, the media, aren't paying attention to, because it's an opportunity. One, of course, those local elections, as you all know, probably more than anyone, have huge impact. And two, voting is also a habit. And if you can just help develop a habit from like a behavioral psychology perspective, that person can become a lifelong voter. They're now voting in the midterms, not just the presidential elections. They're now voting in their school board elections, right? All down the ballot. It's a habit. So this is an org that gets incredibly effective results because they're basing everything they do on real tested data. Or tested methods in the data they gather from those. So those are the resources I would point you to right away. I also have some resources on my website. I think it's under a resources tab. If you go to mollykawahata.com, there are definitely some articles in there that talk about framing, that talk about how pollution is racial violence, that talk about the connection between pollution and Black Lives Matter, and really fundamental parts to how climate addresses racial, social, economic inequalities, improves people's quality of life, puts people back to work, unleashes incredible technological innovation, creates jobs. All of these really good things happen to society when we address climate change at scale. And I really think the at scale thing is key here. So addressing climate change wherever you are in your focus, wherever your children or your students are and what they're interested in, climate change is fundamental to it and related to it. And I guarantee we can all make those connections in ways that aren't scary and damaging to children, right? And ways that are incredibly empowering and hopeful.
Well, thank you so much. And I would ask that after this, if you wouldn't mind just sending me a list of those three resources, that would be wonderful. And we'll also direct people to your website, because I've also personally looked at your website and checked out some of those resources, and they've been super helpful. All right, so we're now going to move into the Q&A portion. And I would like to start off with a question actually from our wonderful co-organizer and our program manager for the Healthy Schools PA program, Shannon Myers. She said, are there any communities that are case studies of doing this reframing of climate change really well? So getting rid of source pollution generally, and especially in environmental justice communities, for example, improving health outcomes, decreasing asthma rates, things like that.
Yeah, one community that's been incredibly inspiring to me, and that's why we featured them in this film I just did with Patagonia called The Scale of Hope, is Richmond, California. And what's really interesting is that I read an article and I was directed to this carbon calculator. And there's this scene in the film where we show this. It was this carbon calculator, and I looked at it, and it was made by UC Berkeley. Now, UC Berkeley is in the East Bay. It's right next to Richmond, California, right? And so without them talking about Richmond, I'm looking through this carbon calculator, and I'm like, okay, interesting. They're telling me to do all of these things to green my life. What would they do and tell somebody to do who lives in Richmond, California, and lives behind the Chevron refinery, where they now have some of the highest childhood asthma rates in the country? as well as increased rates of hospitalization, cancer, lung disease, heart disease, miscarriage, impacts to male fertility. The list goes on, right? What would they tell them? They live behind a refinery. They have dirty air. So it asks for your income. It asks for your zip code. I inputted the information from the US Census data of an average person who lives in Richmond, who works in retail. The results were that it told people to buy a new car, to remodel their home, to buy organic food, to telecommute to work, to print double-sided. It said print double-sided. I was like, are you kidding me? Okay. So are these solutions going to clean up their air, decrease their hospitalization rate, decrease their childhood asthma rate? Probably not at the scale that's needed. Right. You can maybe make some cognitive gymnastics. It's a hard sell. Systemic change is the answer. Policy here is the answer. And it really, to me, reflected a lot of the non-inclusivity that has been inherent in the environmental movement that we really need to address head on. A history of racism and non-inclusivity of a lot of different people. And the carbon footprint in some ways reflects a little bit of this racial insensitivity, because Richmond is primarily a community of color, as they often are, these frontline communities, because that's what we found through the research, is that your zip code is determined by where the zip code is that a power plant, a highway, a toxic waste site is going to be put, some polluting entity, is influenced the number one predictor by the racial outcome of the community that's surrounding it, not even the income, the racial makeup. So with that said, Richmond is one of these communities, and they have some incredible community organizers on the ground who have been doing work day in and day out to fight this issue and to organize the community around it. Now, I have a really personal connection because my family, I'm Japanese American, was interned during World War II. They were, forced relocation from their homes, their businesses. They lost everything. They were put on trains. And my family specifically was sent into the Utah desert. Other communities were sent into the Wyoming desert, the California desert. Mm-hmm. They were sent into places that were considered kind of inhospitable, and they were forced to live there for years. And that's the history of kind of racial oppression my family has experienced. Now, when my family was released, after surviving this, they moved to Richmond, and they were in the East Bay. They were at the Oakland Buddhist Church. And then several of them still live there today, and they see that refinery and they breathe that air. And so it is personal, right? This is what's really important. Public health is personal. Climate change is personal. And I know this is something a lot of communities in Pennsylvania have to live with every day. It is personal. It is fundamental to human rights and our ability to thrive as a nation, as communities. So I would just say Richmond is a great community. They're a great example of what community organizing looks like at scale and what they're doing there.
Wonderful. Thank you. It's always, I feel like it's always a lot more helpful to provide like a tangible example of someone, again, when we're reframing things in this hopeful way, saying, here's a community that's doing it really well, because there is such a long list of communities who are often not in a position to do it well, so it's great to have that example. And moving on to another question from Raina, a challenge in this regard, and I'm assuming this regard meaning reframing climate change in a hopeful way, is the anti-climate regressive portion of our political system has clearly demonstrated public health is not a top priority as much as the freedom to make individual choices, even when this is detrimental to society. When cost and economics/freedom is the key message for some, how do we reach that audience and get them involved?
I think freedom. Yeah. So freedom is a term that's definitely been co-opted in ways that have promoted conservative values, but more so in ways that have promoted a platform from the Republican Party that often tend to lead to outcomes that aren't great for communities of color. That's a really vague way of me saying this. Freedom is, I believe, and patriotism, I think, are two terms that we should take back when we talk about climate change and when we talk about progressive policies that are going to clean up the air for communities that are most impacted. Yeah. What could be more fundamental to your freedom and your ability to thrive than having clean air and empowering your community and the community surrounding you with clean air. That is fundamental to freedom. Climate action, addressing climate change at scale, that is freedom, right? We are in some ways freeing our children and future generations from the impacts of climate change. This is really a fundamental aspect of American life. The other part of this, because we're kind of getting at this conservative language that's been used, is patriotism. That's a term that a lot of people who care about climate change maybe aren't super comfortable using. I consider myself incredibly patriotic because I believe that patriotism isn't blind allegiance. It is not blindly supporting things that are happening that oftentimes are good, but not always good, a lot of bad stuff. It is really caring enough about your country to being willing to change it. I consider a lot of social movements that are fighting against the order, like Black Lives Matter, like the climate movement, incredibly patriotic. Because you're recognizing the problems and you have enough of a stake in it and in your community to be willing to fight to change it. That is extraordinarily powerful and inspiring. And this is something President Obama really kind of redefined patriotism. He considers himself, he would say it all the time, a very patriotic person, because as he would say, in no other country is my story possible. There is another way of kind of looking at patriotism that isn't this blind allegiance, that really is interconnected with fighting for social change. So the freedom and patriotism component, I think, are really fundamental here. And again, it's reframing. You can use those same terms, right? But we just need to reframe them in terms of it's not a dichotomy between public health and individual action, right? Systemic change is freedom. Reframe it that way, right? Just like take the term and associate it with what you want it to be associated with. We can do that in really profound ways.
Yeah, I'm speechless. So many incredible points there. And again, it comes back to the fact, I think we do need to reframe a lot of these terms that we kind of throw around in everyday language in a lot more hopeful light, and also a way that embraces gray area and progress and challenge to norms. Like there's a lot of issues with, looking at the world in this very much, this dichotomy, either this or that.
Yeah, exactly.
And let's see, if anyone else has any questions to ask Molly, feel free to put them in the Q&A portion. I do have one other question queued up from another we person, if we don't have any other questions from the audience. But let's see. And I can also, follow up with an email with questions from the audience members if they think about them at a later time too, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome.
One thing I can mention as another resource that I probably should have mentioned, but this film we just made with Patagonia, which I mentioned the scene that we do on reframing and highlighting the community of Richmond, is the first documentary film that we tried to do that had a mitigation perspective and led on climate hope. Because every documentary film I had seen in every way was really focused on doom and gloom. And it was premised on the idea that you are doomed, I am doomed, and this is a terrible thing. Now, what is that supposed to do? What does that do to children? I hate the impact that has on children. That is not helpful. We should stop doing that. Now, does that mean we deny the facts? We deny the science? We don't pay attention to the enormity of the problem? Of course not. You lead with that. You lead with that narrative that this is serious, it is urgent, it is real. And then you frame it in terms of power and the power that everybody has, the power we have as individuals and as a community and as schools and as neighborhoods, all of these things. You reframe it that way. So this was the first time we tried to do a film that led with the power of hope in the climate movement, and also talking about mental health in both those domains. But I think there's this incredible component here of framing and how we can just change the climate narrative overnight if all of us do it together. But there is such an extraordinary power that I believe educators have. I honestly believe, if there are two groups that are the answer to climate change, it is educators working with children, and it is artists, both of them. artists have the ability to make people feel hope much more effectively than I can, right? Like they can make people feel something. Creatives can make people feel something. So one of the really big things here, I think, is like, I've worked with some photographers that are now photographing pollution in their communities and using their art to highlight the problem. That's narrative change, right? But also getting this next generation to feel something differently than kind of the doom and gloom that's been put on boomers and millennials and kind of Gen Z at this point in time is really important here. Because I am so inspired by Gen Z. I think they are like I think millennials have so much to learn from their activism because they're focused on systemic change first and foremost. They never talk about the carbon footprint at all. They're like, we need change. They voted at historic levels. They changed the outcomes. They were the margin of victory in a lot of elections that ended deciding pro-climate candidates. A lot of them have a nonpartisan perspective, right? They just care about climate change. So this generation is incredible. And I credit a lot of the education that they went through, I'm sure, from educators who told them they have power. They have influence.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
If you have autonomy, you will use it. But people have to be told they have it. And a lot of people have had that taken away from them. So educators have the power to make children know that they have power here. And that's all we need in order to solve this, is people to know they have power.
I think that's it's a really hopeful and inspiring place to end this discussion. We have one more really great question that I would love to follow up with you about, since we are a little bit over on time, if that's okay, specifically regarding how we're allocating funds and making sure those go to environmental justice communities first and foremost. So is that all right if I follow up in an email?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll give you a really quick answer on that. The Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, did do some incredible stuff on putting policies in for the first time that are going to actually target communities of color and frontline communities. So that's a quick answer, but we can talk more about it. The other thing I'll say is we have been doing some screenings in schools of the film, The Scale of Hope, in order to give children more of a sense of hope around climate. So if folks are interested in that, happy to chat or connect you with the Patagonia team.
And I've personally seen the film, and it was really deeply inspiring to me as someone who likes to get involved in climate activism, who works at an environmental health organization. So absolutely, again, it's The Scale of Hope by Patagonia. I believe it's available on YouTube now for streaming.
It's on YouTube for free. Yep.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Molly. We really appreciate hearing your insights. And again, this is the second time I've been honored to moderate with you. So thank you so much for being here today and for a really great discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for being here today, because I really think this intersection between schools and health, which it's healthy schools, is the answer. Like, I couldn't think of better framing. If I was like, let's put together a conference to do this right, it would be this. So I am so grateful for everything that you all do and everything that all of you as participants are interested in, have a stake in, and why you're here, because you are doing it right and you are the answer. And I am so honored to walk on this path with you.
Thank you so much, Molly.
Thank you, Molly.